All right, it's 4 o'clock and apparently we are live. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a new book by Francine Hirsch entitled Soviet Judgment in Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War II, published by Oxford University Press in a session that is co-sponsored today by the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays. We've had a rather full lineup of authors and books that we've featured in this webinar format since July, and there's plenty more to come in the months ahead. If you are not already on our listserv, just drop us a note and we'll make sure that you are. Behind the scenes, there are a number of people who make the seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley and Emma Billings of the National History Center. And today we have a number of terrific tech people from the Wilson Center on board. I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous donors. As always, we invite you to join their ranks. Very briefly, on the logistics front, you should know that today's section is being recorded and can be soon found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Pete Bierstecker, whose email address will be posted in the chat function on Facebook. And we'll try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's really a great pleasure to welcome and to be able to introduce Professor Francine Hirsch to talk about her new book here today. Dr. Hirsch is a historian of modern Europe with specialization in Russia and the Soviet Union, and she's the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has published two books, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, what we'll talk about today, and Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge and the Making of the Soviet Union, published in 2005, which examined the role of ethnographers and other former imperial experts in the formation of the Soviet Union. Empire of Nations received two very important awards, the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize of the American Historical Association and the Wayne Vasinich Book Prize of the American Association for Advancement of Slavic Studies. Her new book project focuses on the history of Russian-American entanglement. We'll look at international relations through the lenses of economics, culture, science, and international law. She earned her PhD and master's from Princeton University, is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, and they include one from the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. So we're particularly delighted to welcome her back to the Wilson Center virtually as an alumna of this institution. Fran, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center, the National History Center, and thank you, Christian, for inviting me here to talk about my book. And as you said, I got to spend, I spent a wonderful month at the Kennan Institute when I was starting this project and working in the archives in and around DC. And it's really nice to be back, even if just virtually today. All right, so to begin, the Nuremberg Trials, also known as the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, took place in the wake of World War II from November 1945 to October 1946 in occupied Germany. And we're actually going to be marking the 75th anniversary of the start of the trials next Friday, November 20th. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Johann von Ribbentrop, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And they also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. Well, this was the first of the Nuremberg trials, and it would turn out to be the only four-power one, although that was not the initial plan. The 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the Einsatzgruppen trial and the judges trial, was carried out by the United States alone. And that's one of the reasons I think that the Nuremberg tends to be so associated with the United States. The film Judgment at Nuremberg, that many people probably have heard of, was based actually on the judges trial. But there are also other reasons why the Soviet role and the Soviet contribution to Nuremberg has largely gone underappreciated. Including restricted access to the former Soviet archives, especially during the Cold War, and also concerns about Nuremberg's legacy. The Soviet role was complicated, let's just say. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. And there were episodes in Nuremberg involving the Soviets that everyone, especially the Americans, wanted to forget right away. And this included the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own war crimes, the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish prisoners of war, Polish officers, to blame that on the Nazis. In a more general sense too, though, the contribution of Stalin's Soviet Union to the IMT, it troubles some people, I think, because it also sort of upends or challenges the myth that I think a lot of people still hold on to of Nuremberg as being kind of fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. But what I want to argue today, and what I argue in the book, is that we really need the full story. The real Nuremberg story is very messy, right? It's also very interesting, and I also think it's necessary. But partly because Nuremberg, it still matters. For some people, Nuremberg remains a kind of gold standard of international justice, and people still invoke it when talking about the way to do something right. For others, Nuremberg is an appalling example of victor's justice that should never, ever be repeated. But if Nuremberg is going to offer any lessons at all, we really do need to understand like what actually happened. So hence what I try to do in the book. First of all, the first aim of the book is to try to bring the Soviets fully into the picture. And it draws on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do this. This evidence includes secret telegrams, letters, diaries, protocols, and in some cases, transcripts of the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. It includes endless surveillance reports too. The Soviets were informing on each other and writing very detailed reports that they sent back to Moscow. It includes lists of possible witnesses and witness depositions. It also includes marked up copies of the indictment and marked up copies of the judgment and other documents that the Soviet delegations secretly smuggled back to Moscow. And these documents, they made their way all the way up the chain of the command to Molotov and to Stalin and all the way back down again. And like for a historian, these documents are incredible because you get to see Molotov and Stalin's comments and how they wanted things to go. Okay. So through all of these materials, we get to see the tremendous Soviet contribution to the framework of the trials and also to the prosecution's case. We see Moscow's decision made fairly late in the trials to bring witnesses to Nuremberg to testify about Nazi atrocities, including the planned extermination of Europe's Jews, what of course we now call the Holocaust. But with all this, we also see the many ways in which the Soviet contribution threatened to undermine the IMT's legitimacy. And that's the rub as it is, right? It's both of those things at once. So the book also aims to use the Soviet piece and the Soviet archives combined with US archives and other sources to also tell a fuller and more nuanced story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole. And what I argue here is that in really looking at the relationships among all 4 countries of the prosecution, including the Soviet Union, this really opens things up, right? There were 4 prosecution teams in Nuremberg. American, British, Soviet, and French. There were 4 main judges, one representing each country of the prosecution, and they also had alternates. The relationships among the prosecutors, the relationships among the judges, the relationships between the prosecutors and the judges are really just fascinating and highly revealing. We see all kinds of clashes about the meaning of justice, for example, and the compromises then that were made on all sides. We also see the importance of the nightlife, the tennis matches, actually, the parties, and the drinking. There was a lot of drinking that happened. And this isn't just for color, actually. It's as a result of the parties and the dinners and the drinking. This helped to keep things congenial when the going got tough. And there are certain times it also helped to keep the trials on track. We also see how Nuremberg and the Nuremberg courtroom in particular became a front of the Cold War over the course of the trials, and how Cold War tensions ultimately, in some ways, helped the defense, I would argue too. All right, so let me just say a little bit about the narrative arc. Okay, the book itself starts in the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter, which kind of set things up, and the indictment, which laid out all the charges against the defendants, against the accused. It then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, the organization's case, and then the judgment, which, to the dismay of the Soviets, resulted in several acquittals and much lighter sentences for some of the defendants than they had anticipated. It ends with a chapter on the post-war period, looking at deliberations about international law and human rights and Nuremberg's legacy. So my aim with the book, it really was to tell a good story, because I think that, again, the archival documents, the materials are so rich, and that's what I wanted to do. And also to introduce readers to a new cast of characters that they wouldn't have met in other books about the Nuremberg trials. You know, and in the book, we see Nuremberg and the trials through the eyes of people like the Soviet filmmaker, Roman Karman, the political cartoonist, Boris Efimov, and other correspondents. And many of these correspondents had actually been embedded with the Red Army during the war. Some of them had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps. And they bring all of that with them to the courtroom, that experience. And they talk about just how difficult it is, the trauma of reliving, right, the war through their experiences in court. We also see the outsized role of Andrei Vyshinsky, who was deputy foreign minister, and so much more. Vyshinsky, Stalin appoints him to head one of the Soviet secret commissions on the Nuremberg trials. And Vyshinsky and Stalin knew each other well, because Vyshinsky had been the prosecutor in the Moscow trials of the 1930s, the Moscow show trials. So again, it's very suggestive. Vyshinsky's role in the trials becomes very important, even though he's only in Nuremberg once for a very short period of time. Okay. Along the way, I make a number of arguments, and I'll just note 3 of them here. First of all, without the Soviets and the Soviet push for what they called a special international tribunal, and without Soviet ideas about criminal responsibility, including crimes against peace, right? The criminality of aggressive war, and crimes against peace was the Soviet term. Without this, the Nuremberg trials, I would say, likely wouldn't have happened. Something might have happened, but it would have been very different. Second of all, the Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion. And they were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism, right? And I argue in the book that the Soviets, they won the war, but at Nuremberg, they lost the victory. Third, by the end of the trials, Nuremberg had become a Cold War battleground. And I think it's really critical that we look at it from this perspective, and this is what we get by fully bringing in the Soviet peace, right? And understanding this also gives us a fresh perspective, I think, on understanding what happens after the trials in that post-war moment and in the post-war struggle for human rights. It helps us in part to understand, I think, why Nuremberg's promise, right, the great promise of the Nuremberg principles after, why that promise was never fully realized. And I will end there. So thank you so much. And thank you again for having me here today. I'm just really delighted.
Thank you, Fran. You succeeded. You tell a really good story.
Thanks.
Let me just say this is up front before we engage in a little bit of a conversation to which Eric and I will invite all of you out there in the Zoom world a little bit later in this program. Let me just say, this is a marvelous book. It's international history really at its best. It's fresh in archival exploration and insights, in its interpretive complications for our understanding of Nuremberg, international justice, and post-war international relations. It's also an immensely readable book. I just love how you bring out the dynamics and tensions, especially, of course, within the Soviet side. Some of it is almost comical if it wasn't serious and in many ways tragic. And the dynamics, of course, between some pretty big egos on the American side and their Soviet counterparts. So you really bring the story and its leading actors to life. And I think what you've written, at least to me, is really a page turner. So congratulations, Fran.
Thank you.
Let me start out by, since the Wilson Center and its History and Public Policy program is one of the co-sponsors of the Washington History Seminar. Eric knows what's coming. Let me just begin by a question about archives. We're the home to the Coldwell National History Project's digital archive. And so documents and archives are our sweet spot. And I'd love if you could sort of let us a little bit into your archival discovery process. What were the turning points? What perhaps were the surprises that stand out even years later, now that you've finished the book?
Oh, I love this question. I could talk about archives all day, so you're going to have to stop me at some point. So I would say when I knew I wanted to possibly work on this, I started off in GARF, right, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, because that's where the big Nuremberg file is. And so you have the Soviet transcript and a lot of other materials. But one of the most interesting materials I found in those first weeks that made me know I really wanted to work on this. And that was this incredible report home by Mikhail Dolgopolov, who was with the Soviet journalist team. He was an informant. A lot of them are informants, so that term, it's hard to say what it means exactly. But he wrote back a 7-page letter, and this was a few weeks in, talking about just all the trials and tribulations of what the Soviet delegation was facing there. He wrote about things, how the Soviet translators and interpreters were not up to the task, and how this was causing the Soviet delegation all kinds of problems. He wrote about how the accommodations were really terrible as well, and how they, some of the Soviet, they had fled this kind of smoky kind of room with a malfunctioning heater, for example. They wrote also about the problems that they were having with like public relations, in the sense that Dolgopolov writes, all the Americans are showing all of their films to everyone here. Like, why aren't we doing that? Like, and he also, this is heartbreaking, wrote about the fact that the female members of the Soviet delegation, like their clothing was so poor that the Americans and the British were making fun of them. And sort of like saying like, hey, if we're going to send our people to the international stage, we need to think about these kinds of things. And so that document for me, like that was like, okay, like, this isn't just a story about the trials, like there's a human story here. And that's when I knew that this was really what I wanted to explore. I worked in 5 archives. So that was some of the things in GARF. In the archive of the Academy of Sciences, that was a wonderful place to work. They have the papers there of the Institute of Law. And we've known for a long time that the Soviet jurist Aaron Trainin had a role at Nuremberg, but at the Academy of Sciences, I was able to read through these incredible, like 100-page transcripts of the meetings that Trainin was at, where he's putting forward his ideas about the criminality of aggressive law, aggressive war. And what I learned was that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had turned to the Institute of Law and asked it to investigate this question of the criminality of aggressive war, to investigate the question of the criminal responsibility of the Hitlerites. And so Trianon is responding to a direct request. And so these reports that he's presenting, and there's back and forth, and as you might imagine, right? Andrei Vyshinsky actually attends some of these meetings. And then this is what results in this book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites, that travels all the way across Europe, that makes its way to the meetings of the United Nations War Crimes Commission, makes its way like across to the White House, and is so important. So again, to be able to look at those materials there, and then to also follow the archival paper trail to how it made its way to the US. So that was really exciting. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive was just amazing. I mean, so many fantastic materials were there. That's where Vyshinsky's files are and Molotov's files. And it was there that I was able to see all kinds of secret telegrams. I mean, the telegrams were constant. The Soviet delegation was constantly reporting on what was happening with the trials, what was happening with the other members of the Soviet delegation, the things to be aware of, to look out for, and other things too. There was one of my favorite telegrams was a telegram from London when they were working on the Nuremberg Charter. And the informant there writes home and says, we have a problem. You know, Rudenko, who was Rudenko, he says, he doesn't seem to know very much about Soviet-German relations. And Rudenko was a Soviet chief prosecutor. So again, the fact that they had kind of sent him into this situation without all this information, again, those kinds of documents are great because they also make you ask all kinds of questions, right, about what's going on and what's happening behind the scenes. I'll mention a couple more things, but the party, I worked also in the party archive, and I was able to see these letters that the Soviet playwright and writer Vsevolod Vishnevsky was writing home, again, talking about the situations and the nightlife. And he was really bothered by the nightlife. He really felt that the British and the Americans in particular had no idea what the Soviet people had suffered. And so again, those kinds of materials were great. And also in the archive of Russian art and literature, I was able to read through diaries and letters, again, of people like Vishnevsky and the filmmaker Roman Karman. And again, you really just see things unfolding through their eyes, which was so important too. So, I mean, it's funny, the things I'm talking about here, it's not as much the ins and outs of the trials, like that was really interesting to study as well. But the material that really spoke to me as I was getting into the project were the materials that really let me see also the human side of things and all of these interactions, and just to get a sense of like, who were these people that the Soviets sent to Nuremberg, right? Like, what are they coming with? What are they experiencing there? And to me, that's what made it such an interesting story. But I can go, there's just, the archives are great. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that being able to read those kinds of materials against materials from US archives. For example, like Jackson's diaries are in the Library of Congress, and they are amazing, amazing. And so to look at Jackson's reactions to things and compare that with the Soviet reactions, and to read things against each other, right? That's the beauty of archival research. And to look at Maxwell Davis, the British deputy chief prosecutor. So Jackson's US chief prosecutor, and David Maxwell Fyfe is the British deputy chief prosecutor. And again, just to see how all these people are in the same room and describing the same situation, it was really fun to work on. It was really fun.
Fantastic. Quick follow-up here. Are there any collections or topics that you could not really get archival closure on? Yes.
Yeah, there always are. And I think, it's interesting. So there are a few things. One of them is Katyn, right? Which there's a lot that I was able to see. There are things that other scholars were able to see, and that I was able to, there's a really good document collection that was really helpful to me as well. But then there is still, there's a question that someone just asked me recently, which is, like, do we know at what point, like what Moscow said to Nikitchenko, like what happened? Because so we can talk about, so Katyn anyway, this massacre that the Soviets try to get in there, they argue for the inclusion of this crime that they themselves have committed. And then at the end, it gets dropped from the judgment. And I would love to know, like, who said what to Soviet Judge Nikitchenko. So that's one of the things that I think is still like a pretty big open question.
Great, thank you. So when we think about the Nuremberg war crimes trials, we often focus on its lasting influence on international law, justice. But one of the things that struck me most about your book was that Nuremberg was also, and for the contemporaries perhaps first and foremost, a struggle over the narrative of World War II and Nazism. If you can talk a little bit about this point, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was absolutely a struggle over the narrative of the war and of the rise of Nazism. And I think one of the things that that I found really interesting when I was doing this research was seeing how much it was a struggle over the narrative among the victors, right? Among the countries of the prosecution, and how even on the eve of the trial before it started. And a lot of this came out in the deliberations about the indictment, right? The indictment was actually a massive document, massive document. It didn't just list the charges, it laid out all the charges in great detail and also included a very detailed history of the war. And each victor wanted to tell a somewhat different story. Each wanted to omit different things. The Soviets, they wanted to fully play down the Soviet-German non-aggression pact of August 1939. Like, I'm not even talking about the secret protocols here, but the pact itself even. They were concerned that that non-aggression pact would be seen as a springboard for the invasion of Poland. The French and the British, they wanted to play down the Munich Pact of September 38, in which they had turned their backs on Czechoslovakia. So those things are playing out. And again, I could see this like through Moscow, through all the correspondence between Moscow and Nuremberg, where Moscow's like just saying, you can't let this in, right? And just directing the Soviets about what they should do about this. Interestingly, so the prosecutors, they all agree on the eve of the trials that the trials are only going to focus on European Axis crimes. They even go further than that, though, in their quiet meetings. They agree that it's not just that only European Axis crimes will be tried, but the prosecutors agree that they're going to keep the trials. And like the whole thing just focused on European Axis crimes, and the fact that they're going to try to keep their own war crimes, anything uncomfortable, out of the courtroom. And this is actually at Jackson's initiative, the U.S. chief prosecutor. He suggests that they all submit lists of things that they want to keep out of the courtroom. And the Soviets, they work on their own list of, they don't admit to any crimes in it, but what they would consider taboo topics. The thing is that the prosecutors all agreed on this, but the judges didn't, right? And the Western judges, they become very, very concerned about accusations of victor's justice. And all the more concerned because the Soviet judge, Yona Nikitchenko, he just is very clear that he thinks that they're all guilty and should hang. And so the Western judges, they really pushed back against this, maybe even going further than they would have otherwise. And they end up giving significant leeway to the defendants. And what happens then, so we have this struggle over the narrative among the prosecutors, the countries, and we also have then the defendants using the courtroom to put forward their own narrative of the rise of Nazism and the rise of the war as well. And one of the really big things is, one of the charges, of course, it's crimes against peace, the criminality of a war of aggression. And so one of the big pushbacks is arguing that the war was not an aggressive war, that it was a quote unquote preventive war. And so the defense works really hard to try to push this narrative through. And the Soviet judge, Yona Nikitchenko, has very little success actually in court at shutting some of this down. And the defendants go on for a very long time.
Thank you. One of the most important, perhaps the most important contribution of your book to me is giving us a much richer understanding of the Soviet approaches to post-war justice, international law, the Soviet contribution to the legal framing of the Nuremberg Charter. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this, especially, you alluded to this already, the role of Aaron training.
Yeah, sure. So I guess just to start, I would say that, again, the Soviets are starting to think about war crimes and how to deal with them and war criminals very early on in the war. In April 1942, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Molotov's, creates a special commission to evaluate the international law perspective on reparations. And that's how Aaron Trainin gets pulled into things from the start at the Institute of Law. And part of the reason the Soviets want to do this is because Nazi atrocities are just so terrible, and the devastation in the Soviet Union by this point. So there's just a sense of needing to deal with this. Then in October 42, Molotov calls publicly for a special international tribunal and invites all interested governments to cooperate in bringing the Nazi leaders to justice. The US and the British, they're pretty slow to come on board. The US is worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. The British think, well, like, why should we have trials? They actually think that an executive order, an executive decree would be much more effective, and that the crimes of the Nazis are too great to deal with by some kind of a trial. So the Soviets at this point, they're kind of walking their own path. They have their own War Crimes Commission, the Extraordinary State Commission. They don't participate in the United Nations War Crimes Commission. But what's happening all the while is Aaron Trainin, who had started working on these questions in April 1942, when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs kind of came to him and his colleagues, he's starting to talk about, again, the criminal responsibility of the Hitlerites. He's writing lots of articles in what will eventually become this book, talking about the criminality of aggressive war and how crimes against peace, it's not just that they're wrong or illegal, but that these are punishable crimes. And that was the thing that had been sort of left unclear earlier with deliberations and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And so there is uncertainty. Is this illegal? Is this not really illegal? And I'll just say here too, that the Soviets, they were not concerned about ex post facto or retroactive law. They had no problem with it. And so with the Soviets eventually being one of the 4 countries at the table, and the Nuremberg Charter being based on law from all 4 countries, right? That was one way to kind of get this in. So that's pretty significant too. Trainin, it's crimes against peace. He also makes very important arguments about conspiracy and complicity. Here too, drawing upon writings that he had done earlier with the Moscow trials. So that's kind of this interesting history to it. And he also makes arguments against the defense of superior orders, right? The defense that I'm just following orders. So he really brings that to the table as well. And so, Trainin, he's really at the forefront. And again, lots of people are talking about aggressive war, but it's his ideas and his formulation that kind of make their way through. And it's part of why Trainin is one of the people who sent, along with Yona Nikitchenko, to the negotiations in London for the writing of the London Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, it's called both. And that's part of why crimes against peace ends up being one of the formulations in Article 6 of one of the main counts.
Thank you. Why Nuremberg and not Berlin? Why Nuremberg as the site for the tribunal?
Yeah, the Soviets are still the Soviets were asking that for long after that happened. No. So initially, the Soviets were pushing very hard for Berlin. And Stalin wanted Berlin, right? Molotov is insisting on Berlin. Berlin, while not part of the Soviet zone, is physically within the Soviet zone, right? The site of the Nazi capitulation in the East, the home of the Allied occupation government. The Americans were pushing very hard for Nuremberg. They talked about it as being important because it was the birthplace of the Nazi movement, but they really wanted the control of it being in Nuremberg as well. They wanted to be in charge of the communications. They wanted to be in charge of food supply. There are actually some really interesting memos about this as well. And the Soviets, this is one of the issues that they compromise on. They compromise on it in August 1945, right at the tail end of the London Conference, right after Potsdam. And part of why they compromise it, it's part of it's logistical and financial. They realize that it's going to be pretty expensive to hold these trials, and there's talk about like billing the Nazis for it after, but it's really not clear. Like someone's going to have to lay out this money up front, and they understand that if they have it in Nuremberg, if they do agree to this, that the Americans will pay for it, at least initially, and the Americans will handle the logistics. But the other thing is that they really think they're getting something important in return. It's agreed that Berlin will be the permanent seat of the IMT, and that the Soviet judge will preside at the opening ceremony, the opening sessions at this permanent seat in Berlin. And so they're comfortable with that, right? The Americans can pay for stuff, and they can still have this experience of presiding. But there's another thing too, which is that, again, people, the idea at the time is that there'll be multiple Nuremberg trials, right? And that there'll be multiple four-power trials, and that initially it's talked about that this will be something that will rotate. The first one will be in Nuremberg, and then they'll decide where the next one will be. And if Berlin is going to be the permanent seat and the Soviets, right, then they're getting that as well. So of course that didn't play out that way, but yeah.
Thank you. I think somewhere you write that the politics of this huge, huge indictment that you've already talked about were really about the politics of history.
Yes.
Could you unpack that a little bit more? And I would love for you, and again, you already alluded to that in your opening remarks, but talk a bit about Katyn. I think that's very central to this. And, you know, I learned a lot about Katyn just from its role at the trials, which hadn't been clear to me as somebody who knew about the massacre and its role, but what essential role it played in Nuremberg, I think is a fascinating aspect of your story.
Thanks. So I want to say kind of at the start too, that in order to even understand what the Soviets think they're going to be doing with Katyn, and then I'll describe what Katyn is as well, but what their expectations are for what Nuremberg is going to be, right? And what their aims are. The Soviets take Nazi guilt as a given. There's no question. They are expecting guilty verdicts down the line, right? They are expecting hangings. This is the trial that's going to happen before the hangings, and that's really how they're viewing at it. They see it as an opportunity to demonstrate Nazi guilt, to relate Soviet suffering and Soviet heroism. They did not expect the defendants to take the stand. They did not expect the defendants to be able to call witnesses, right? They expected that the evidence presented by a National War Crimes National War Crimes Commission rather, including their own, in the Extraordinary State Commission, and then the commission that they set up to investigate Katyn. They expect, because of something called Article 21 in the charter that states that evidence presented by National War Crimes Commissions that's incontrovertible, they interpreted incontrovertible to mean that it could just not be challenged, period, right? And of course, that was not the case. So these aims and expectations shape their personnel as well. Almost all members of the Soviet legal team, they were involved in the Soviet show trials. The judge, Yona Nikitchenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, right? So that's part of what's going on as well. And they also think that they will fully be able to control the script, which is just really naive when we think about it, but again. So that's part of why they didn't bother to initially tell Rudenko about the secret protocols to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact in which Hitler and Stalin agreed to divide up Europe. And it's also why they thought it would be easy to include the Katyn massacre in the indictment, right, as a Nazi crime when in fact it was a Soviet crime. So this massacre, just to kind of then go back to the beginning, as we now know, like now that we have the evidence, that this was a massacre that was committed by the Soviets, right, in the spring of 1940, I believe, before the German occupation of the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets commit this massacre, and the Germans found the graves and blamed it on the Soviets. This was still during the war. And it was this kind of political hot potato that was being kind of tossed back and forth with blame, counter blame. At the end of the war, the Soviets thought, okay, the Nazis have been defeated. This is going to be easy now. Now we can just like make it stick. And we know from the archives that the Soviets had actually been considering holding their own separate show trial in occupied Poland just for Katyn. And then this is one of those things I wish I knew, like exactly whose bright idea was it, but someone had the idea up at the top, like in one of the either in Smersh or which is in one of the counterintelligence agencies. Anyway, someone decided, no, let's just like bring it into Nuremberg. And so we see it being introduced as this crime that the Soviets had committed, this massacre of thousands. I think the numbers vary, but probably more than 20,000, right? Polish prisoners of war, a massacre the Soviets had committed. Now the Soviets insist during the writing of the indictment and all of the back and forth of the indictment, they insist on including it as a German war crime. And first they just put it in there, right? And then the other Western prosecutors are just like, are you sure you want to do this? Do we have good evidence of this? Even if it's the case that this has already been such a political issue that, we do really want this back and forth. And Roman Rudenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor who's engaged in these deliberations about the indictment, he says, my hands are tied. Like Stalin wants it in there. If you don't want it in there, I'm going to have to go back to Moscow. I'm going to have to talk to Stalin personally. This is going to take a few weeks. And the Western prosecutors, at that point, they let it go. And again, this is like to emphasize that it's not at this point. There's evidence. The governments have. We now know that the governments have evidence that British and American leaders had evidence about Soviet responsibility. It's not clear how much the prosecutors knew. My sense, again, from reading the various documents against each other, is that Jackson, again, the U.S. chief prosecutor, Maxwell Fyfe, British deputy chief prosecutor, who were engaged in these negotiations, they had very strong suspicions, but there was nothing like definitive. And so it goes in. The indictment is published. The very day after the indictment is published, Jackson gets secret intelligence. I found this kind of, again, reading some information from the Cornell archives, actually, and the Donovan collection, that Jackson gets information saying, yeah, we're almost positive the Soviets did it. Like we have some evidence now, and it's too late. It's too late. And so there's this, the kind of, he's advised to try to talk to Rudenko. Maybe Rudenko will just like not talk about it and just kind of let it go. But the Soviets are not going to let it go. And then during the Soviet case in February, the Soviet deputy chief prosecutor, Yuri Prokhorovsky, is the one who presents the falsified evidence of Katyn. Again, the Soviets, the defense is petitioning for evidence. Goering's attorney is petitioning for evidence. And the judges decide they're going to allow it, that they're going to allow. So what the decision is, and again, just like Nikitchenko, who just, they're just 3-1, 3-1, 3-1. They're outvoting him like down the line on this, that they're going to allow the defense to call 3 witnesses for Katyn, but they're also going to allow the Soviets to call 3 witnesses for Katyn. And this happens at the very tail end of things. In July, it's kind of one of the last big things of the trial, and it's pretty inconclusive, actually. One of the tricky things is that the defense is not, the Soviets are not on trial. So their defense isn't allowed to try to make a case that the Soviets are guilty. The defense is in the position of just presenting evidence to show that they're innocent. And a lot of it really comes down to like, when did it actually take place kind of thing. Right. In the very end, right, it gets pulled from the judgment. And that's what I want to know more about. So if anyone out there has more information about that, let me know. But yeah, that's, it's a low point. It's a low point for the Soviets. It's a low point for everyone, right? That this should have ever been allowed to get in there. It threatens the legitimacy of the trials. It threatens the legacy of the trials. I mean, that and the secret protocols, I think, are two of the most important reasons, again, why the Soviets are kind of left out of a lot of the narrative about the Nuremberg trials when we want to tell this uplifting story, because there's just nothing uplifting about that.
Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating. I've only gotten through the first few of a long list of questions, but time is running away, and I want to invite Eric Arneson to join the conversation, and then we'll also want to open it up for Q&A with our audience. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. So I want to use Katyn as a way of kind of opening up the larger question of legal culture. You've talked about the legal theoretical contributions that the Soviets made, but I guess in retrospect, the audacity of trying to pin Katyn on the Germans and all of the efforts that they undertook on the ground, to plant evidence, to bring in outsiders, to pin this on the Nazis, kind of suggests a certain, lack of sophistication and or a sense of nuance with regard to evidence and its interrogation. And so what struck me in reading this is the clash or the difference in legal cultures between the American, British, and to a lesser extent French, and the Soviet prosecutors and legal folks. If your main background is the Soviet show trials of the 1930s, as you point out, cross-examination is not the Soviet specialty. Right? You've got witnesses, they've been beaten, they've been tortured, they've been coached, they read their script, and the outcome is determined before you even start. So the Soviets show up in Nuremberg and they don't know how to interrogate or cross-examine witnesses. So if you could just talk a bit more about the differences in legal culture that in particular, I think, put the Soviets at a real disadvantage going into and through the trial, and how they learned over time from especially their American and their British counterparts.
That's a great question. Soviet legal culture, first of all, I would say it's complicated because on the one hand, you have people like Aaron Trainin at the Institute of Law, right? Who were educated in Western European legal traditions, who were part of international conversations about international law. Trainin spoke many languages. He himself had studied in Germany for a time. So there is a certain legal culture that we would recognize as a legal culture right. So there's that, right? At the same time as there's that legal culture, there's also the show trial culture. And that's where you have, again, it's the decision to send people from this show trial culture, the decision to send Nikitchenko and Rudenko, who did not have experience abroad, that's what they were good at show trials. And so that's part of what's going on. So that's kind of one part of the question. At the same time, there are these there are different expectations about what a trial is supposed to look like. That's right, the Americans and the British, that's more of the common law system, which is more adversarial, where the prosecutor is expected to present the evidence, the judge is expected to be sort of an outsider, unbiased, coming to things fresh, right? In the civil system, it's more inquisitorial, the system of the Soviets and the French. In that system, the indictment contains all of the evidence, so it's examined ahead of time, whereas there's much more of in the common law system is much more presenting the evidence as part of the trial, and that's why cross-examination is so important. So for the French and the Soviets then, coming from this other system that's more inquisitorial, the Soviets have different expectations about what role the judge is going to have. They're shocked at this idea that the judges are supposed to be really neutral parties, and they think the case has already been made, right, in the indictment, and now it's just putting it forward and deciding on the sentences. So that's part of what's happening there. At the same time, again, the civil law, common law, that's all very well and good, but the Soviets have a whole other thing going on, right, as well. Again, with the show trials, with the role of Vyshinsky. And so they are. I mean, it's audacious and what they try to do, and they're incredibly unprepared. In terms of the cross-examination, there are parts of it that are well, it's sad and almost comical at the same time, in the sense that some of the archival evidence, you actually see them. They know that there's going to be some back and forth, so they write out the questions that they're planning to ask. And they give Jackson one of these sheets at some point for someone that he's going to cross-examine. And he's just like, no, I don't need this, thank you. So they write out the questions along with the anticipated answers. And then, like, what do you do when you don't get the anticipated answer, right? How do you go on the fly with this? And so there's that part. And there's also, this is also so important, the Soviet delegation, they're afraid. Right? That's part of, and that's just not the legal culture. That's the culture of Stalinism. They're afraid. First of all, they're not allowed to make decisions on the fly on their own. All of the other delegations have just a lot more autonomy. Like, they can be more flexible. Yeah, sure, they're checking in. Jackson's checking in with Truman. Early on, he's checking in with the OSS, then with Army intelligence. There's back and forth. But the Soviet delegation, they're on, just a short chain. And that's part of why they're constantly smuggling documents back, because they need approval. They're afraid to go forward without approval. And there are moments where they do go forward without approval, and then they're called back, and they're in big trouble. So that's part of it too. It's really difficult to operate this way on an international stage when, again, not just the legal culture, but your whole culture is so very different in that way.
Just if you could just amplify one of the things that you just said, because what struck me in the book is the complete and utter lack of autonomy that the Soviet prosecutors had. So everything has to be cleared with Moscow and or with Stalin himself. And similarly, the prosecutors don't actually have the knowledge that they need going in. So they're not aware of the secret protocols on the non-aggression pact. They're not aware necessarily of the Katyn massacre and their actual responsibilities. So they're kind of driving, without a roadmap to a certain extent, and then a roadmap is handed to them from Moscow. So how does that kind of affect, well, I guess my question answers itself, how it affects, their ability to do this job. You could just say a little bit more about that control.
Yeah, it makes things incredibly complicated for them. I mean, early on in the trial, well, first of all, like, documents get lost. Like, they're not supposed to be sending some of these documents back. And so they're smuggling it back through different channels. It takes time. Things get lost in transit. And then when things get lost, they're left stalling. So there's a moment early on where they come up with this whole excuse that the Soviet chief prosecutor has malaria, and that they have to delay the start of the trial. And that's because they haven't gotten their instructions in time, right? So that's part of what's going on there. Later, I mean, they're always like 5 steps behind, because they're always waiting for these instructions. And by the time that they get these instructions, everyone else has moved on. And that's what's really difficult too. A big thing is the judgment. So, there's when you read the Western books, like some amazing Western books, right, about the Western, the narrative of the trial, some of the classics, they talk about how the judges are all like sequestered, and they make a really big deal about how every day they burn the trash so that everything will be very private and controversial. I don't know. Nikitchenko managed to smuggle out an entire draft of the judgment and the verdicts that made its way back to Moscow and all the way up the chain of command. And then he gets back, I don't know, like a 12 or 15 page list of instructions about, again, like, because they're furious in Moscow when they find out that there aren't going to be guilty verdicts down the line, and that there are going to be some lighter sentences perhaps. And so, instructions about, how to try to convince the judges that you have to make Lawrence, who's the British judge and the president of the tribunal, Geoffrey Lawrence, you have to make him understand that the world will not stand for a soft judgment. And so, but again, by the time that Nikitchenko gets this, because there's no internet, right? It's just like weeks, it's too late. It's gone. Like, that ship has sailed. Those decisions have been made. And so, again, that expectation of being able to confer. The one time that's the big moment, there's one time that Wyszynski comes to Nuremberg in November. And that is at the very beginning of the trials, about 5 days in, because this is after London, when they've told him that, like, hey, Rudenko doesn't know about the secret protocols. Rudenko doesn't know about the whole history of German-Soviet relations. He doesn't even really know about the history of the war. And so Wyszynski shows up in Nuremberg. He's there for a few days. Now, remember, he's the head of a secret commission. Like, no one's supposed to know that he's even involved in the trials. He's in Nuremberg, like, as an honored guest as deputy foreign minister. But there are these, he holds some meetings with everyone, and that's when he basically fills them in and explains to them. So that helps for a little while. But no, it's crazy, really. Just it's about the legal systems, but it's so much more than that. And they really, I should say too, like, they realize they learn certain things along the way. Like, they get better at this, but not better enough, I would say, as well.
Thank you. Let's open it up to questions. Perhaps ask one more question, but encourage our audience to use the raise hand function to signal that you'd like to ask a question, or use the chat function on Facebook to send us a question, or email a question to Peter Bierstecker at the Wilson Center. Fran, Stalin, what was his role in all of this? I mean, is he the elephant in the room?
Pretty much. So Stalin is, he's watching things pretty carefully. I would say at the very start of the trials, maybe not as much, or before the trials begin, like while they're working on the indictment, there's a trial that at the time that where Stalin's like kind of recovering from, exhaustion or illness. And so he's not as much involved, but then by November, December, by December, I would say he's following things much more closely. And in January, during the winter break, when the members of the Soviet delegation, some of them stay in Nuremberg to work on things, and some of them are called back to Moscow. And it's at that point, this is again one of those other things that I wish I had more information on. Like, we have the list of who Stalin received, right? We know he received Rudenko twice. We know what happened afterwards in terms of how Rudenko and the Soviet delegation started to adjust and change the Soviet case, right? Expanding it, bringing in new evidence, making decisions to call in eyewitnesses. That's Stalin's doing, right? But that's pretty much, you can see it from the meetings of the Politburo Commission and the way that it cycles down. I wish I knew what they actually said in that office together, but he's watching the whole thing and taking notes, I would say, as well.
Thank you. All right, let's go to Eva Ahrens. If you could please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. You're still muted, as far as I can tell. Well, it's always a bit of a problem. Let's go to one of the questions in the chat room, and perhaps Eva can resolve the technical issue. Question from Michael Binder: were the indictments evenly balanced between crimes committed in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, or did the fact of 3 Western powers judges and only 1 Eastern power judge skew the trial more towards the judgment of crimes committed against the West?
I would say that it was evenly balanced, and that in fact there was a significant amount of evidence about crimes committed in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. One of the things that's, I think, interesting that unfolds during the trial, so the way that the case is divided up, the Americans, and Jackson ends up introducing a new count, conspiracy. And so the Americans present on conspiracy. The British present on crimes against peace, and then the Soviets and the French divide war crimes and crimes against humanity, with the French presenting on war crimes and crimes against humanity in Western Europe, and the Soviets presenting on war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But one of the things that happens is, because the evidence is just so horrible of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, when Jackson is presenting the case on conspiracy, the Americans actually end up presenting a lot of that evidence. And the Soviets they're not sure how to feel about that, right? On the one hand, they're glad that this is being presented, but on the other hand, they were a little worried that the whole trial is going to turn into an American show, that they themselves had been planning on presenting some of this really powerful evidence. That's part of when Rudenko goes back to Moscow in January. That's my sense, is that that's part of the discussions and why they start pulling in new evidence as well, evidence that the Americans and the British and the French didn't have and weren't able to present.
Thank you. Let me call on Jeff Herf. Jeff, if you could please unmute yourself.
Yeah, the book sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading it. Hartley Shawcross at the trial spoke a great deal about the crimes against the Jews. And I entered the webinar a bit late, so you may have spoken about this. How did Rudenko respond, and did the Soviet team discuss how to address the persecution of the Jews and the Holocaust?
So thank you. So it's one of the myths about Nuremberg in some ways, that the Soviets didn't talk about the Holocaust or the crimes against the Jews. And that has to do in part with Soviet war crimes trials before Nuremberg, which they referred to crimes against all peaceful citizens instead of in cases where the victims were clearly Jewish. And it has to do with what happened after Nuremberg as well, with the anti-cosmopolitan or big anti-Semitic campaign. But at the trials, especially in their presentations on crimes against humanity, the Soviets presented very clear and compelling evidence of the crimes against the Jews. Lev Smirnov was the Soviet prosecutor who was in charge of that case. And I mean, the evidence, it's terrible and shocking. And it's really all about these plans for extermination that were carried out. Not just that, but when the Soviets make the decision to bring in witnesses, they decide to bring in witnesses like Paulus, right, who they have imprisoned, but they also decide to bring in eyewitnesses. And one of the most powerful eyewitnesses they bring in is the Yiddish poet Avraham Sutzkever, who testifies in the trial about, again, the extermination of the Jews in Vilna, talking about it, bringing in some general evidence. Sutzkever had worked with Ilya Ehrenberg after he was rescued and airlifted out on the Black Book, putting together evidence of German crimes against Jews. And then he testifies in person using some of this evidence, but really even more talking about his own personal experience and the murder of his son. And so if you go through the transcript, there's quite a lot about the Holocaust that's in the transcript as part of the Soviet case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Question from Michael David Fox, Georgetown. Hi, Fran, you mentioned Katyn in your presentation. Can you elaborate on the Soviet attempt to blame the Germans for the 1940 massacre and how this figures in your broader account? Did the testimony of the deputy mayor of Smolensk, Basilevsky, play a significant role? You've already talked about Katyn, so I think that question is largely taken care of, but perhaps the testimony of the deputy mayor of Smolensk, Basilevsky, and his...
Yeah, hi Michael, I know Smolensk is near and dear to your heart. So, yes, I mean, the Soviet, I would say that, again, how much of any of that testimony, quote unquote, mattered, right? In the sense that Basilevsky had been very well prepped ahead of time. He was one of the witnesses that when the Soviets actually brought a bunch of journalists to the gravesite in January 45 in order to prove their point even earlier about Nazi guilt, and Basilevsky was part of that whole show as well. And so, he does as expected, right? But I would say it's none of the Soviet testimony is enough to undo kind of the suspicions that the Soviets are lying.
Thank you. A question from Dan Caldwell. An estimated 2 million German women were raped by Soviet troops. Was this crime against humanity ever discussed at Nuremberg?
So again, that is one of the things about Nuremberg. It was decided at the very start that it was going to be limited to European Axis crimes. And so none of the war crimes, crimes against humanity, anything committed by any of the victors, none of that was discussed at all in the trial. But I would say, again, that's part of this question, this part of what complicates, again, the story of Soviet involvement. And that's part of what complicated it at the time and after the fact. Yeah, I mean, people understood that the Soviets, I'll let it stop it there, but it's difficult. It's a difficult topic, yeah.
Question from Eric Lohr. Could you say a little bit more about what you learned about the four contrasting attitudes towards cultures and procedures of law and prosecution? To what degree did the Soviets there understand or misunderstand the three legal cultures they encountered? Were all the divisions 3-1, or did the Soviet side ever get support? So this builds on Eric Arneson's earlier question.
Yeah. So I would say, again, the Soviets and the French are much closer and much more in agreement about a lot of things in terms of, again, how things should play out. A lot of the legal culture questions come up in London during work on the charter, the framework of the trials, right? Once that's set up, it's kind of there in writing what things are supposed to look like. Those deliberations are incredibly interesting because it's like, what is an indictment? How do you understand an indictment, right? And it's clear that they understand an indictment to be a very different thing. Like, what is the role of a judge in a trial? It's clear they understand that to be different as well. The thing, in terms of cross-examination though, the French do pretty well at that, right? It's the Soviets who really have the hardest time. And again, I would say that's not so much because of Soviet legal culture as much as it is the people who they've sent to Nuremberg, right? And the show trial culture that they themselves have come out of.
Thank you. There's another question from Eric Lohr. Since Eric Arneson posed in part his earlier question, how did the Soviet experience at Nuremberg compare to East German trials, collaboration trials elsewhere in the USSR and Eastern Europe? Have you looked at that?
So I have not studied that in detail. Do you want to elaborate how it would compare in what respect?
Well, we would have to get Eric Lohr online. And Eric, why don't you raise your hand, then in the chat room, I can call on you and we can engage you. But there's Eric. All right, if you can unmute yourself, great. Eric, now you can ask your own question.
Okay, well, I don't actually know the history of East Germany and trials in East Germany. But I read Ben Frommer's book about the collaboration trials in Czechoslovakia, and it just raised the question whether, there was any impact or learning from the Nuremberg experience on these other trials. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that the way to answer this question in part is to, again, emphasize how unusual Nuremberg was, right? There were war crimes trials that were being carried out by all of the victors. The British were carrying out war crimes trials. The American military was carrying out war crimes trials. The Soviets were carrying out their own war crimes trials, as were the French. And so what was very different about Nuremberg was that you have the coming together of these four countries with these four different legal cultures, from these four different governments, also with these four very different experiences of the war. And so in some ways that keeps things in check in a way that's different from other Soviet war crimes trials. I would say that the Soviets, had the Soviets been carrying out the Nuremberg trials, Katyn never would have been questioned, right? And what happens with some later trials in the Soviet Union, and from my understanding in reading the work of scholars who have worked on Eastern Europe, is that part of why it's so difficult to study some of those other trials is that you have people on trial some who actually were collaborators, right, and committed war crimes trials, and then others who had not, or we don't know that they had, but they're on trial because they're seen as political enemies for other reasons, and then they're accused of being collaborators. And so, that doesn't happen at Nuremberg, right? That's one of the ways I think in which Nuremberg is really unique.
Thank you. Question from David Gerber. Given what you have said about Soviet defensiveness in the face of the intricacies of striving for justice at Nuremberg, what was the Soviet response to the judges' trial? I know that process was an American matter, but nonetheless, the ideological corruption of a justice system, the charge against the German judges, could certainly have been made against judges in the Soviet system regarding the show trials, which went on at many levels of society for years. It is not an international matter such as crimes against peace, but ultimately involved the crimes of the domestic judicial system against itself, against its citizens. That seems very close to home for Soviet judges, doesn't it?
That's a really interesting question. The Soviets were not following, at least so far as I know, some of the details of what happened in the subsequent Nuremberg trials that they themselves were involved in, except for the industrialist trial, right? That's the one that they were very upset about. That's the one that they thought that there were light sentences, and that's the one that they talked about. Again, that's really the only ones that they talked about were all the industrialist trials they thought were like a farce, and that they thought that they were too light because they thought the Americans had been in cahoots with the Germans, and that's why the Americans didn't want there to be more foreign power trials. But they don't, so far as I haven't seen their discussion of the judges' trial at all. Although it would be interesting, back in the Soviet Union afterwards, there are all these anti-corruption trials against Soviet judges, and Nikitchenko actually gets swept up in that. But it's a really different story and not comparable.
Another question in the Q&A function. Given the objections by lawyers to the Nuremberg trials based on ex post facto law and other reasons, were the trials valid?
Oh, that's one of those questions that, right, were they valid? Sometimes people ask me if they were just or if they were fair. Were they valid? It depends on like what criteria. Again, if you're bringing together 4 different countries, if you're saying that a country is based on the law of 4 different legal systems, and that you're going to bring it together, and you're going to allow in some charges, and you can say that we can have some ex post facto because one of the countries doesn't have a problem with ex post facto, then in terms of the structure that's been set up around this particular trial, I would say I don't know, valid, not valid. They would say that it was valid. One of the really interesting things about ex post facto, I would say too, is that there's a whole bunch of OSS reports that were filed right around the time where they were thinking about doing a Nuremberg trial. And I saw those in the Library of Congress archive. They're amazing. And some of them are in the Jackson files. And in these reports, the OSS is talking at length about this ex post facto question and about the fact that the Soviets, it's not a problem for them. And so that works its way in. I would say that it's a consideration, right? And so they decide that it's valid, right, because of that. I'll address that question too about just like justice or fairness of it. I think the fact that Katyn is expunged, right? The fact that that there are in fact some acquittals, the fact that there are some lighter sentences, I would say the judges just went so far out of their way. They were so concerned with this issue, this question that you're asking, right? About justice, about victor's justice. And so they themselves wanted to make sure that the trials would be seen, right, as just and fair as possible. And some of the judges were not satisfied afterwards. The French judge, de Vabre, who becomes very involved in discussions after Nuremberg about the potential for an international criminal court, he says, like, I don't think this was just. Like, I have problems with the fact that should it have been the case really that for victors we're trying an occupied power, right? Should we do some kind of an international criminal court in the future? He says, we have to change that. We have to shift that. So I think that that's interesting too, that, and that to me as a historian, that's what's most interesting. It's just the ambivalence that some of the main people participating, right, felt about these very questions.
Thank you. Let's go to Ilya Altman. Ilya Altman, if you could please unmute yourself.
I am Ilya Altman, Russian Holocaust Center. Greeting from Moscow. It's late evening, but thanks for your
thanks for coming from Moscow.
presentation. I think all my colleagues not be asleep. If you have opportunity to listen your lecture, I will be happy to read your book in Russian too, because I understood in the previous time I worked in the State Archive of Russian Federation, and so maybe one of the first these materials. So for me, very interesting your idea to present on the base of this book. And I listened today some new about academic training. I think nobody pay attention his contribution in the Nuremberg Trials. So it's really very interesting. One question and one short comment. Did you find the project of speech, the first speech, prosecutor Roman Rudenko, where he mentioned 5,900,000 Jews that was killed? This figure was destroyed from in his speech, it's not exist. So maybe in some materials, some correspondence between Moscow and Nuremberg, somebody from Kremlin told to him not necessary to put this figure. It's very important because in his speech, firstly, Soviet sides recognized like officially 6 million victims of the Holocaust. My second question and comment at the same time, you not mentioned Russian historiography. When you spoke about Katyn, I know that Natalia Lebedeva, Dr. Natalia Lebedeva, described all these questions. So I don't think that you could pay, and maybe I am wrong, something new in this points. Also, Alexander Zvyagintsev recently published a lot book and movie, and his in the theater, November 20 will be the movie on his screen, like Roman Sheinin, he repeated some of these processes. But maybe what was your opinion about the Russian, maybe Soviet historiography? Because Arkady Poltorak was the first person who described this, and he mentioned that the Gilbert diary not published in Russian, but it's very interesting. He firstly pay attention in his book to these very important sources. But this is, my question is about historiography and Rudenko attitude to the Holocaust. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you. That's so important. So first of all, if you read my book, you'll see that I cite Natalia Lebedeva at length, along with Alexander Zvyagintsev. They are there's amazing scholarship that has been done in Russia with the opening of the archives on the Nuremberg trials. A lot of that scholarship has been in the form of these document collections. And when I mentioned in terms of what I don't know about Katyn and the fact that some of the, I think I meant as part of that, some of what I learned from some document collections. Some of what I learned about Katyn was indeed from the research of Natalia Lebedeva and putting that together with the materials that I found as well. Marina Sorokina's work on the Extraordinary State Commission is amazing. There are so many Russian scholars who have done really great work. Unfortunately, some of that work hasn't made it into kind of still like the narrative that we have here, the story that we have here of the trials. And so again, like my main aim of this book was to tell this story and to bring in the archival research that I've done with everything else that's been published in these document collections, and with the earlier scholarship in the United States as well, which is also really good. It's just a question of how do you shift the perspective by bringing all of this together and weaving it together into one narrative. But no, absolutely. And for those of you who read Russian, Natalia Lebedeva has an incredible document collection and has done really great work. And her work on Katyn has been translated into English as well, and I highly recommend it. In terms of that figure of in Rudenko's speech, I don't know. That's a really good question, but I could check my documents, send me an email, and I'll check and I'll see if there's any mention of it. What I do know in terms of the transcript of the trials, the figure 6 million is mentioned by Maxwell Fyfe, and that's part of where we get that the British deputy chief prosecutor in his closing speech. So yeah, that I'll just leave it at that. But no, absolutely. I could not have done this work without just, again, the archives and archivists and my conversations with Russian scholars as well. So
thank you.
Thank you. Question from Sarah Brinegar. Hi, Fran, could you talk a little bit about the trials in the emerging Cold War? Would have also been one of my questions further down, the Cold War at Nuremberg.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in terms of thinking about the Cold War is that the Americans and the Soviets in particular, right? It's a story about 4 powers, but the Americans and the Soviets in particular are really in kind of a collision course, kind of from the very start. And some of this is, the Soviets have suffered so much, right, in this war, 27 million dead. Just atrocities. The Americans have had a really different experience of the war and come out of it really expecting to kind of lead the world, right? And so they coded Nuremberg with different things. The Soviets are expecting a trial that's going to be open and shut. Truman and Jackson go in really wanting to kind of showcase American rule of law. And so this is, there's kind of tension from the start, this even before the Cold War, on what's going to happen and how things are going to unfold and what things are going to look like, but things are still very congenial. Things stay congenial. It's really in March of 1946 that the Cold War just comes like blowing into the courtroom. And some of this is Winston Churchill gives his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, right, in the United States. He's no longer prime minister, but no matter, he's still quite a state figure. And in this Iron Curtain speech, he calls for kind of resistance against Soviet tyranny. So, okay, that's one thing. The very next day in the Nuremberg courtroom is the start of the defense case. So the timing couldn't have been worse in that. The Soviets they've just finished their presentation, their prosecution case. They've done very well with it. And now the defense case is going to start. Churchill has made his speech and everyone goes into the courtroom. And there are copies of the US Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, everywhere, with the defense attorneys kind of holding it up so their clients can see, with the headline, "Unite Against the Russians." And really, from that point on, tensions that had been kind of boiling underneath come much more out into the open. And Arkady Polcharak, actually, who one of the speakers just mentioned, who has a wonderful memoir about Nuremberg, he writes about the scene as well. And he talks about Goering's reaction to the scene. And kind of the line that he uses is that Goering understood at this moment that it wasn't just the defendants against the prosecutors, but it was also the Western powers against the Soviet Union. And the defense is really hardened by this and uses this. They really just increase their efforts to try to increase the gap between the Soviets and the other countries of the prosecution. And we see from telegrams home that the Soviets really feel this, right? At this moment, they feel things starting to shift away from them, and they feel themselves becoming increasingly isolated. So that moment is important. And throughout the defense case, there are still lots of parties, there's still lots of alcohol that still keeps things going and just fine, keeps things on track. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders are furious and really start to interpret at that point decisions that are made every time Rudenko is voted, 3-1, put down, and more defense evidence can come in. And every time the defense is allowed to go on at length about the secret protocols, Ribbentrop manages to bring them in, and his witnesses do too, right? This is seen as part of they talk about it as an Anglo-American plot against the Soviet Union. And the one other thing that I'll just say is that this really has implications too for what happens after the trials as well. It's at the trials that kind of this Nuremberg and the Cold War really become entangled. And the whole language of human rights afterwards becomes used kind of in the Cold War by the different powers against each other as well.
Thank you. A question from Elizabeth Schall that basically, that maybe builds on this earlier discussion. Does this interaction at Nuremberg influence the Soviet interactions later in international organizations such as the UN?
Absolutely. It absolutely influences them. And that's one of the things that I start to explore in the last chapter of the book. I'm actually really interested in it. And at some point, I'd like to do more on this. Because the Soviets, first of all, the Soviets understand that international organizations are important. Right? Everyone understands that international organizations are important. They're going to be important. They're not going to withdraw from the United Nations, right? They're going to be there. At the same time, it's not just the Soviets. Everyone's kind of queasy about sovereignty, like state sovereignty. So they want to use these new institutions, right? But they want to use them to their benefit. They're a little bit wary about them. And the Soviets also use other institutions that we don't talk about very much, such as the International Organization of Democratic Lawyers, I think is the name, that the Soviets, that involves countries from the Eastern Bloc. And, and now we look back, like, what was that organization? It's talked about as a communist front. It became a communist front. But initially, when we think about the post-war moment, it's not just the United Nations. There's actually lots of different organizations. And while the United Nations is clearly going to be significant, the Soviets are also hoping to use these other organizations at the same time to help to shift the discussion in the United Nations in ways they want as well. So, yeah, everyone is wary. I think this is the really interesting thing about Nuremberg again, right? It's one thing for countries to go in and in an occupied country and to try a power that's been defeated. It's really something else entirely for countries to come together and decide that there should be like an international court, to decide that there should be these international legal institutions, and to decide that they're going to give up some of their sovereignty in order for them to function. It was because of this reluctance, to put it mildly, to give up sovereignty that I would say the International Criminal Court was deferred until well after the Cold War. It was because of this too that, after Nuremberg, there was all this talk about the Nuremberg principles, taking the principles in Article 6, like crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and turning that into new international law. And so, the principles everyone could agree on, but making it into a new international law code, there was pushback against that, again, because of sovereignty. Countries have to be willing to give up something to decide that it's, to participate in these institutions, they have to be getting something that they really want back. And so I think that that's something that came out of Nuremberg as well, just a recognition that, the Soviets thought they could control the show, and they saw that they couldn't, and they took that understanding of international institutions with them.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time. Let me see how many questions we can still get in. One question from John Trevithick. What is the difference between the two secret Soviet commissions you mentioned? Why were they created?
Oh, good. I love talking about the nitty gritty of this stuff. So, there's actually more than two secret commissions. There's actually a secret indictment commission initially too, where the Soviets set up under Vyshinsky to kind of work on the indictment. And then the indictment commission is kind of folded into Vyshinsky's Nuremberg commission. And again, that commission deals with all the nitty gritty stuff on the ground. Vyshinsky is in Moscow. Many members of the commission are in Moscow. They include representatives from all the branches of the Soviet security apparatus, but they also include people like Aron Trainin, right, and other lawyers. And so that commission, there's a lot of back and forth between the Soviet delegation and that commission. There's also the second secret commission is a Politburo commission that's set up and attached to the Politburo high at the top. So you have one secret commission, but Vyshinsky's commission still has to get all the important things cleared, really probably everything cleared with the Politburo commission as well. So again, we just get a sense here too of just the amount of centralization and the amount of oversight that's involved in all of this.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but let me just give you a chance at this very end before I'll turn it over to Eric to bring this session to an end, to talk about the legacies of Nuremberg. If you've talked about them already to some extent, but is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of the larger meaning and legacies of Nuremberg?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, this is something I've thought a lot about, especially with the 75th anniversary coming up, right? And I think that, again, we tend to have these stories about, victor's justice or like Western idealism. I think bringing the Soviets in kind of complicates in some ways, like what we understand about Nuremberg's legacy. First of all, I think it reminds us that Nuremberg was not inevitable. It was not simply a result of Western leadership or Western idealism, right? It was really a result of lots of negotiation and compromise. And I think what I want to say about this is that all of that negotiation and compromise doesn't not make for a less heroic story. When I first started working on this, a few people asked me, "Are you sure you want to work on this? Like, people really like Nuremberg. Like, why do you want to throw a wrench into it?" And I think that it's really appreciating like all of the compromise, all of the negotiation, how hard it was to bring these countries to the table and to get stuff done. Like, to me, like, that's really what's heroic, right? That you have these 4 different countries with different experiences of the war, with different ideas about the law. The fact that they were able to come to the table. Now, we might not like everything that came out of Nuremberg, but it did put together a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich. It did set out a foundation for new laws about human rights. And yes, some of those were deferred until like 1998, but I think that's still part of Nuremberg's legacy as well. And no, I think in that respect, it's a good legacy. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
All right.
And thank you so much. This was so much fun to have this chance to talk about the book today.
It was indeed. So thank you, Francine, and thank you, Christian, as well as those of you who asked questions. And thanks to Tracy Fitzgerald and John Tyler of the Wilson Center, who oversaw the tech end of things. Unfortunately, that's it for today. But the Washington History Seminar returns soon, this coming Monday, November 16th at 4 p.m. in our regular time slot. I invite you to join us for a session on a new book by Eileen Boris entitled Making the Woman Worker: Precarious Labor and the Fight for Global Standards, 1919 to 2019, with discussant Sonia Michel of the University of Maryland and formerly of the Wilson Center. Until then, take care and stay safe in these rather tumultuous times. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.